I'm gonna dive in. First thing, we got a little bit of news for Asians Represent. A little bit of news. I guess it's not really for Asians Represent. It's a little bit of news for me. And it's related to this topic. I got this in the mail. I got my silver Ennie for my work on Haunted West. I am honestly super hyped. We've received two Ennies in the past. This is my first one for writing, and this one's special actually because Chris Spivey was one of the first people to ever hire me for TTRPG work, and so this one really means a lot to me. And because Chris was kind of like one of those folks who gave me a shot, right? And now what I try to do is I try to pay it forward, with our platform. But that said, for this episode of Asians Represent, we're going to examine, I will say, and Stefan and Steve, you that's going to confuse me. That's going to trip me up. It's going to happen within these 2 hours.
That's all right.
If you disagree with this statement, I encourage you to step in. But I'm going to say that we're going to examine one of the most commodified aspects of Asian culture, and that's Kung Fu movies and their important influence on Black empowerment. And in order for us to tell that story, we actually have to go back to 1973. Now, Kung Fu films have been around for a while. In Asia, there have been tons of martial arts films, but in the 1950s and 1960s, wuxia films were actually the really popular films in the Hong Kong action cinema industry. And it wasn't until the 1970s that they really took off. And this growth in Hong Kong action cinema as it relates to Kung Fu films coincides with Hong Kong's economic boom at the time. And on a very special day of May 16th, 1973, this sort of Kung Fu craze that you see everywhere kind of just appeared out of nowhere. Now, it didn't really appear out of nowhere, but on May 16th, Variety, which is a magazine at the time, reported that 3 movies, Fist of Fury, Deep Thrust, The Hand of Death, and Five Fingers of Death, the latter of which being the most significant in this conversation, Five Fingers of Death, were ranked 1, 2, and 3 respectively on Variety's top box office draws of that week. And this was the first time that 3 foreign films had ever occupied the top 3 slots. Now, this is also interesting because Five Fingers of Death had been at the top of this chart for the past 7 weeks. This was a monumental moment for foreign films in the United States of America. And because of that, and that year alone, coinciding again with this economic boom in Hong Kong, over 30 martial arts films were released in the US by predominantly 2 studios, Shaw Brothers and Golden Harvest. And of these included one of the most, I'll say it, the most iconic and influential martial arts movie of all time, Enter the Dragon, starring Bruce Lee, Jim Kelly, and John Saxon. And that's what we're going to be talking about today, because while these films were called chop socky films because they had those over-the-top stories, they had sort of like visceral violence, often poor dubbing. These movies had a huge impact across artistic genres and marginalized communities in North America, even after the death of Bruce Lee. And because of this craze, a lot of people kind of dove into why this happened and how this happened and the mechanism for the growth of Kung Fu cinema in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And then we'll later talk about the 90s and 2000s because I want to talk about Wesley Snipes because I will talk about Blade any opportunity I could get because it's one of my favorite movies, one of my favorite characters of all time. But film scholars note that the interest of the Black community in Kung Fu cinema was that one of the major contributing factors to this craze. And so for this episode, Stefan and Steven, I said Steven, I tripped up already. I said Steven. I never say Steven. I say Steve.
That was so weird. Like, are you mad at me? Like,
I know.
what did I do?
I know. I tripped up there. And I said I was going to do it once in the 2 hours, and it just happened within the first like 10 minutes.
Get it out of the way.
I get it out of the way. But what I wanted to talk about was, for this episode was the nuances of why the Black community was so attracted to Kung Fu films. Like martial arts in general, beyond just like media, martial arts like as a practice. But I want to talk about that. I want to talk about why there was this strong visceral connection that is very much still a part of today's climate. Later on, and I don't mean today, but on a later episode, we'll also talk about anime, because that in and of itself requires an entire episode to discuss these connections. But I think that this one is sort of like the foundational episode to understanding where this connection came from. Now, before we dive into this question of why there was this attraction to Kung Fu cinema from Hong Kong, we need to do an introduction. Our guest, Stefan, who are you? I know you. I think you're brilliant, but the audience needs to know all about you.
Sure. Yeah. I'm Stefan Huddleston. And you'll hear people call me Stefan too. And that's totally acceptable because the Cajun side of my family, the Creole side, uses that pronunciation. So I answer to both. But I am a history professor, and I teach sub-Saharan African history. I teach the histories of marginalized groups in America from the beginning to now, and I teach pop culture and Asian history. So I do like things like African American cinema history. I do TTRPG history, and all of those fun sorts of things, and all of the intersections and particularly how marginalized groups engage not only in mainstream American culture but in pop culture, both here and in Africa. And then some also I do some things with South Asia as well, and the cinema of South Asia, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and all of that. So yeah, and I'm on Twitter always rambling about either political issues or game issues.
Well, you are the most qualified person to handle this topic with us.
Yeah. I mean, you say rambling, but literally every single time I've read anything you've written, even if it's a throwaway, it was valuable. And when you put effort into a Twitter thread or any other statement like that, I think people really should be listening, because like you said, you have the credentials, you've done the work, and you're packaging it up in a way that I think is actually incredibly accessible to a wide audience. And I have to gush a little bit here and say that I've learned a thing or two just from your work, and thank you for everything you've done so far and the things you will do in the future.
Thank you. I will say that it's so awesome and so heartwarming to hear you say that, because one of the goals I have is that for a very long time, I think there's been kind of an ivory tower positioning for academia, and I'm amongst some people in academia who are trying to tear that down, because I think that a lot of the situations that we find ourselves in, be it misinformation over COVID, misinformation over history, misinformation over politics, and the way things have been done in the past, and reflect on things that are happening now, has come back to bite us, because those of us who are in academia aren't sharing these things out in the public sphere as much as we should be. So to hear you say that, thank you so much, because that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to continue Steve's this train of gushing over you and how awesome you are, I one thing you get when you come onto Asians Represent is praise. There's one thing everyone gets; it's guaranteed if you come on the podcast. But yesterday, you after I said to you so Steve, last night I was supposed to be, if Tanya DePass and B. Dave Walters are watching this, I'm sorry. Last night I was supposed to be working on Motherlands, and I just got really into just rewatching old movies and putting together the new graphic for this podcast, and last night at like I think at like midnight here at Eastern, I sent it to you, Stefan, on Twitter, and I was like, oh, I'm super hyped about this one. And then you put out a Twitter thread, and your Twitter thread talked about you going to those that
Mm-hmm.
grindhouse cinema, the
Yeah.
most accessible form of theater to a lot of
Yeah.
marginalized communities. And
Mm-hmm.
that was the first thing that I wanted to talk about because it's an experience that I've
Yeah.
never had. My kung fu film sort of experience was going to Blockbuster, or if you're a Canadian, going to like Rogers and renting those VHSs. It's like
Yeah.
once a week it would be one or two with my dad, and we'd grab one or two movies, and every single week it would be something different. Like I'd go through
Yeah.
phases, like I've seen every single Jackie Chan film. And it's like, let's start with Jackie Chan because, of that age. And then let's go backwards. Let's watch the classics. And then I gotta say, I think when I was 17, I watched Shaft for the first time, and it changed my life.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I dove into the Blaxploitation genre, and
Yeah.
it I never realized how closely connected it was to Asian cinema until I became an adult.
Yes.
Because in my naive sort of understanding, it's like, oh, like their form is bad, um, or like why are they doing martial arts? Why is Jim Kelly protecting a dojo from this like Italian mob boss?
Right.
um,
Right.
but when I started to do research for this episode, and when I read your Twitter thread, I realized that those movies exemplified the unity between our communities. And I say our
Yes.
communities really broadly, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
because this also counts a lot of marginalized communities in North America at the time. And your experience is just so different from mine, but I think we've come to the same sort of understanding that access to martial arts films, and when I say martial arts films, I mean kung fu films, because that's obviously the topic of this podcast,
Mm-hmm.
is what kind of brought our communities together in many ways. Would you agree?
Yeah. I would totally agree. I think that we see uh you know historian me will dive in here a little bit and talk about how in the obviously as these films were becoming popular in America, and really taking off in America, we're like kind of at the tail end of what is called the civil rights era, and the all of the what was going on in the 60s. And historians use this term called the long 60s, where we talk about the period from roughly 1955 till about 1979, because you can't like cram all of that, everything that was going in the 60s. You can't just cram it into that like numerical decade. There's so many things like that lead into it and that come out of it. And so for African Americans, as they were going to protests and rallies and marches, they were encountering the same sorts of things that protesters encounter today with police brutality and other things that were going on. But at that time, obviously, there had been this kind of very long and ongoing conversation, and then the rise of like the Black Power movements with the Black Panthers and things like that. And we were getting into this place where it was finally kind of open for us to kind of like push back and not have to passively take these things. And so many African Americans very quickly lashed onto, and uh, not just here, but in when I say African Americans, I think Black people in general in the West. So we even see some reflections of this in Canada, even, and in parts of Europe too, to some degree. And they are, but here in America, definitely we see people gravitating towards the martial arts, not just in film, but in taking the martial arts. So in 1969, a man known as Grandmaster Steve Muhammad forms the Black Karate Federation. We see a lot of black kung fu schools springing up, particularly in San Francisco, where we have, and Los Angeles, the West Coast, where we have large Asian populations, large, especially Chinese populations, and a lot of uh, black communities are kind of making this exchange, and they're learning the martial arts as a way um, to push back, but also to kind of like defend themselves and kind of learn some techniques to kind of thwart, the blows that will be coming their way. And uh, so this whole intersection of film and the actual martial arts themselves just resonates just very quickly as a symbol of empowerment to be able to uh, and I argue there's this long history of disarmament amongst black communities, right? Of being disarmed, of not being disarmed. I mean, come on, the National Rifle Association, the one time that they support a gun control bill is when Reagan makes it illegal to carry guns in the open. Why? Because the Black Panthers are appearing armed in the streets and monitoring what police are doing in their neighborhoods. And then they appear on the Capitol steps and say, "Hey, you have this Second Amendment thing. What about us too?" Right? And this is the NRA coming out one time and saying, "Oh, wait a minute, gun control? Yeah, we need gun control." All of a sudden, which because the people were black. So there's so this ideal of being able to defend yourself bodily without weapons to be able to do that thing just has a deep deep resonance in black communities. And this is why this moment is so critical, like the intersection of coming out of those the civil rights movement and the 60s, and then these films becoming popular. It's kind of like a quote unquote perfect storm.
Yeah, I think um I think with you mentioned sort of Black Panthers and the civil rights movement. And I think one of the things that I think really ties a lot of the kung fu movies of the 70s and 80s together are those like core themes, right? Of resistance against oppression, right? In kung fu films, it's often
Hmm.
the Japanese, the colonial
Yes.
efforts of Japan and China. That defiance against
Hmm.
injustice, right? You see that in almost every Bruce Lee movie. Self improvement, the ability to train yourself. And then, of course, and we'll talk about like the Wu Tang Clan later, but themes of like honor, loyalty, and community. I think that the community part is super key. But on top
Hmm.
of that, I think your Twitter thread really brings to light one thing about that. These movies were being made, they were being made in Asia. But the key thing there
Yes.
about Kung Fu films is that they were accessible. And I think it's
Yes.
really important to talk about the accessibility of them because based on the metrics that I have for our listenership, I would suspect that a lot of folks who listen to this podcast have never heard of a grindhouse theater and what that actually means.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. That's probably fair.
right? Because you had these theaters, I mean, very famously on like 42nd Street in Manhattan, but they were all over North America, like your
Hmm.
experience, because your experience
Yes.
is a grindhouse theater. They're inexpensive,
Hmm.
right? They're accessible, and they have programming that is just constantly running.
Yes.
Um, and that was really the key. Another thing that I think is that if you look at heroes at the time, and this is where my expertise really lacks, and I sort of will do a handoff to you. But if you
Yeah.
look at cinema and like black cinema around the time of Bruce Lee, you see this like contrast, and this is potentially where I maybe don't have as good of an understanding of blaxploitation, but you have the characters of blaxploitation films, and then you have folks who embody sort of more heroic things like Sidney Poitier, Richard Roundtree
Hmm.
talked about how like one of my favorite records, not again, we said this before the recording, not the best movie, not the best sequel, better than Cleopatra 2. Um, but
Right.
like Shaft's big score is one of my favorite films. Richard Roundtree, Shaft, iconic
Hmm.
blaxploitation film. But there's this
Yes.
sort of dichotomy between the types of characters portrayed in black cinema at the time. And because of the accessibility of kung fu films in the grindhouse theaters, you got to see a hero of color constantly in the cinema. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's completely accurate, And for those who haven't seen the thread, I was talking on Twitter about how, as a kid, in the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, I lived in Alhambra, California for a while, and there, right down the street from where I lived, just off the corner of Garfield and Valley, there was a theater. And during that time, Alhambra was kind of transitioning. It had been predominantly, overwhelmingly white community, and it was shifting heavily Asian at this period. And so one of the theaters, there were actually a couple. There was one further down Valley as well. That these theaters shifted, and this was at the time when the multiplex was just beginning to kind of come into America. So we were starting to see where they were just beginning to build these larger. At the time, I say larger, but I think the one they built by me was like 8 screens, in comparison to like the 20 screen or 30
Yeah.
screen monstrosities we have now. But the most of the theaters at the time were 1 to 3 screens. Uh, up until that point. And so these were, these two places were little 2 screen houses, and they changed in that late 70s period to, like you said, the grindhouse format, and they focused both of them on specifically on Asian cinema, and on the uh, weekends, all day long, it was martial arts films just constantly running. And so you could go in, you could pay 50 cents and get in and get a bucket of popcorn and just sit there all day long, and watch martial arts films. And there were certainly some Saturdays or Sundays that I did exactly that. I would sit there for hours just watching wall to wall martial arts films. And, it's important to understand, I think, for people that at that time frame, one of the things I talk about a lot is that for me, watching television, watching films, certainly I watched these films, and I watched blaxploitation films, but the majority of mainstream media, what we saw in television, what we saw in mainstream films, the heroes were white and male, almost overwhelmingly. There were those exceptions like Ellen Ripley and things like that, but almost overwhelmingly white and male. And if there were any black people involved, they were the sidekicks. They were the thugs. And it was a similar thing for any people of any color.
Look at
And
Green
so it
Hornet.
was very rare. Yeah, like in Green Hornet. Yeah, they were the side. Even though Bruce Lee kind of steals the show there,
Of
he's the
course.
sidekick, right?
Yep.
Um, but but we see that throughout all of our media, and there's signals encoded into those things. So classic television shows like the A Team, BA Baracus is the one who does all the physical labor. He's also the only non-commissioned enlisted. He's the non-commissioned officer. He's the only non-com there, right? The others are officers, right? um the original Battlestar Galactica, Boomer is like the sidekick, right? He's kind of like, there's the loyal kind of friend who they call in for things like that. And you see that pattern throughout late 70s, and early and through the 80s television, right? Is that format of, well, we're going to have one person of color on the team, and we'll give them something to do. And so for me, even though I didn't realize it at the time, I internalized so much of that heroes were white, because that's what I saw in most mainstream presentations. Even though I had these other things like blaxploitation films and martial arts cinema, they were not part of the mainstream story that I was being fed, just like everyone else was being fed. And so they were cool and they were fun, but I didn't see them as at that time when I was younger as true heroes until much later, just because I was so acculturated into this like American myth of, well, this is these guys over here, these are the heroes, right? These other ones, yeah, they're kind of cool presentations and stuff like that, and they're fun and they're amazing, but they're not the heroes, right? They're heroes, but not the heroes.
Can you talk about, because we've mentioned blaxploitation. Hey, first of all, can you, for the audience, describe, like, explain what blaxploitation and just exploitation cinema in general, because blaxploitation
Yeah,
is just a genre, it's a subgenre of exploitation cinema. But I think one thing
absolutely.
about blaxploitation films is that they often also portray negative stereotypes. Um, can you kind of dive into that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, exploitation films in general really come from this idea, as American cinema, of course, people have heard that American cinema for a very long time was working under the motion picture production code. And the motion picture production code gave these very strict rules about things that could and could not be done. So this is why, as the code starts to disintegrate in the 1960s, it's a critical and kind of iconic moment when Sidney Poitier slaps a white man on screen in a major motion picture, because that was unacceptable under the terms of the code up until then. A lot of people don't realize that the Supreme Court had ruled in 1915 that films did not have First Amendment rights, that they were commercial properties and they did not have First Amendment rights. And so when films first started to come out, there were a lot of films that were early films that in the pre-code era, full of nudity, full of these other things. And the studios create the production code as a self-regulation tool because they were afraid that the government was going to come for them and put governmental restrictions on them because they did not have First Amendment rights. They don't get those until like 1952. Um, and so they put this code into place and it makes all these rules. You can't have what was termed in the thing miscegenation or interracial relationships. You can't have um, uh, kisses that are longer than 3 seconds. There's all these very specific rules and things like that. But in the 50s and 60s, there were films that started to push back against this and play in these grindhouse type theaters, these smaller houses where they were pushing back against these things and doing things, whether it was nudity, whether it was horror, blood and gore and things like that, and they weren't films that were stamped by the code. And basically people then began to quote unquote exploit these genres for money and produce these films for money that had a certain set of similar traits. So we have, gore exploitation and all these other types of films that are out there. And the blaxploitation genre particularly plays on this ideal of films that are largely made by Black creators with Black casts as the leads, that are going to play up on these new ideas of Black empowerment and Black power, and try to shift some of the narratives that had been in American cinema about African Americans. So African Americans are now in blaxploitation films. They're able to be the hero. They are able to be desirable, right? They are able to be sex symbols. They are able to kind of forward that ideal of Black is beautiful, and all of these other ideas that just weren't allowed up until this time. And yeah, there are a lot of stereotypes, I think, in blaxploitation films. And I think what people need to understand most about blaxploitation films is that most blaxploitation films are also kind of in a way experimental films, because these are the very first time that Black voices are being heard, not only as actors, but in many, many cases with blaxploitation films as writers, as producers. And so they are doing things to, um, in some cases, challenge some stereotypes, but they are also kind of raised within and acculturated within American culture, right? And so some of those stereotypes that we see are things that are things that African Americans had been raised to believe about themselves or to do about themselves. And beyond that, there are some of these things that are stereotypes that are still, even though they're negative stereotypes, they're still common in African American communities, and so they will appear in these films. Um, but what we also see is this shift where African Americans are able to find their voice. And certainly as they do that, and I think this happens with any community, as they're beginning to find their voice in a particular medium, there are stumbles and there are triumphs. And sometimes it gets a little bit messy because everyone's trying things and saying, what can we do? Um, and there's a balance here. They're mimicking Hollywood in some ways and trying to subvert and invert Hollywood in some ways. And that's something that you see globally in similar cinemas. You see this in Bantu cinema after the fall of apartheid, or even before apartheid falls. You see it. You see it in South Africa. You see this in South Asian cinema. Before and after the British leave, is you see these things where they're navigating um, the strains of colonialism. And there are those in the Black Power movement who argue that African Americans are an internally colonized people. So part of what you're seeing in Blaxploitation cinema is them navigating the strains of colonialism.
Oh, I never thought about Blaxploitation films as experimental. But it makes sense, right? The accessibility of theaters at the time and the ability to make low budget pictures like that gave you a voice, and it only makes sense that you would experiment with said voice and try to do things like experiment with how white supremacy is making you think about yourself, and how you can subvert that. And based on my research, and these also just happen to be films that I also really love, the Blaxploitation genre really, like, some say it hit its the pinnacle of Blaxploitation is Richard Roundtree's Shaft in 1971 in terms of like quality, not only in like the cinematography, the action, the script, the acting, the music. Like Shaft is one of the most influential ones. But then I think in terms of our topic, when we talk about the intersection of the Black and Asian communities, Cleopatra Jones, which came out literally 2 months after, the nexus of 3 Hong Kong films reaching the peak of the box office. Cleopatra Jones comes out like 2 months later, or just under 2 months later. And you see a Black woman who is essentially James Bond, using martial arts to fight against white people. And I recently rewatched it, and by recently I meant I watched it during my lunch today. I was like, I'm gonna sit down and watch Cleopatra Jones. And there was one lunch. It was a great lunch. I was like, I have a crush. But when I was watching it, there was one thing that I noticed, and I never noticed it before. There's a group of characters, and they are originally working for the villain, or allied with the villain, Mommy. There are these Black characters who are allied with Mommy, and they break off from her. But that group of Black characters, they have a white European butler. They have a white European butler who drives them around, and they mock his accent and the way he speaks and how he understands their world. And I did not realize that until today. And when I watched it, I was like, holy shit, this is huge. Like to see something, I feel like the only time I've had an experience where I can feel like, holy shit, I've never seen that before, is when Glenn and Maggie kiss on The Walking Dead.
Because
They did more than kiss, but like, let's be
Yeah.
honest. Until that point, to see an Asian character and Asian and like basically to see an interracial relationship between an Asian man and a white woman is just like it's like unheard of on mainstream media, right? So to see
Yeah.
that, so that was my moment in The Walking Dead. Like, yeah, I was in the comic, but seeing it on TV was just a completely different experience. So when doing research about Cleopatra Jones and Shaft and seeing the how visceral that reaction was to the black community when those films came out, like I get
Mhm.
it. I
Yeah.
get it. And they are incredible movies that take aspects of Asian culture, so the martial arts, and you could see the elements of the martial arts movies, not just the moves, but also, the way they interact with one another and the sort of the way honor is portrayed in those films. And you could
Mhm.
see it, especially in Cleopatra Jones, because it is that moment when it's like Jim Kelly and Enter the Dragon, but it's just Jim Kelly. I mean, he had
Yeah.
Black Belt Jones, which is, in my opinion, an inferior movie to Cleopatra Jones. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but that is the point when I'm like, oh, we've overlapped in media. We've
Yes.
truly overlapped in media in a way that Enter the Dragon was for the Chinese community, Cleopatra Jones was for the black community.
Yeah.
And I think, in my
Yeah.
opinion, it would have been cool to see an Asian character in there, but it's not necessary because it's not our story. Um,
Mhm.
but I think that movie is incredible. Um,
I'm
and
right there with you. Right there with
I
you.
think that movie's great because it is a really good example of how I think black cinema and black media has borrowed from Asian
Mhm.
media in a way that is appreciative. It's not appropriative.
Yes.
And I think
Yeah.
that really dives into, a question that we have from one of our patrons, Jeremy. Shout out to Jeremy. Um, Jeremy asked, and Jeremy said, if there's time or interest, there is both time and interest for this question. Asked, I wouldn't mind hearing y'all touch on what you think of the Wu-Tang Clan, since they're a constant example that gets brought up in internet discourse when people are accused of culturally appropriating Asian traditions. A lot of people say, but what about the Wu-Tang Clan? It's kind of tricky to talk about them, and it might not be entirely appropriate for this episode. Jeremy, I disagree. I think it's extremely appropriate for this episode
Mhm.
because they've kind of built their image around Asian grindhouse cinema.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the important thing here is that there's a lot of discussion going on the internet, and a lot of times what happens and what we see is we see strains of some white paternalism kind of injecting themselves and coming across as like, hey, wait a minute, but what about this over here? um and I sent out a tweet about it the other day about trusting that BIPOC creators can handle their stuff. And if they're creating something, you just need to trust them that, yeah, if they want to say that I want to have this white artist do some art that's African inspired, trust that the people who called on them to do that, who are part of the community they're asking them to do the art for, know what they're doing, and you don't need to try and inject and say, oh, that's appropriation. And I think that a little bit of that is what happens with the Wu-Tang Clan a lot, um because what you have there is not appropriation. um I teach on appropriation a lot, I talk about appropriation a lot, and that is not it. That is cultural exchange, which is a whole different animal. And there is a deep respect within what the Wu Tang Clan are doing for Asian culture and for martial arts films in particular, and the genre and what that genre means and does for Black communities. That's the root of what um, the Wu Tang Clan has always done, um, from the get go, and that's and you can see that beyond. And I think one of the important distinctions here is it's not just them using those as a commercial enterprise, but they are also out there, particularly before the stream. Daniel mentioned RZA going out and supporting and the Asian community, right? Um, there is a respect there and an aid there that goes both ways, I think. That kind of moves it out of appropriation. Appropriation is really this idea where either A, you are laying claim to something that you did not create and calling it yours, um, as opposed to having a respect for and sharing things within. And that's what we want, is we want people to celebrate our heritage, to celebrate our cultures, right? Part of the tweet that I sent out was that those who know the role playing game Coyote and Crow, um, Connor Alexander has put out multiple messages where he's like, "Look, I keep having people saying, well, I don't want to play this game because that's for you." And he's all, "No, we're sharing this game with the world. We're sharing these ideas with the world. That's what we want people to play this, right? We give some things and some suggestions for how not to be appropriative, but we want you to play this. We want to share this." And that idea, I think, applies um, in what's going on with the Wu-Tang Clan. This is an exchange and a sharing of cultures, not appropriation.
Yeah, I think power is a key dynamic there, right? I think a lot
Yes.
of people, specifically with RPGs, see when they say, "Oh, this is an Asian setting," or "This is I work on Motherlands. This is an Afrofuturist sort of setting." A lot of people see that and they immediately say, "Oh, this is a barrier to me participating." And that's
Yeah.
not what that, and that's what you're saying. It's not a barrier. It is an invitation to learn,
Yes.
right? It is an
100%.
invitation to learn. And for me, I had an experience with that actually on a project that I'm working on. And I wanted to write an Asian faction in this being super vague. I wanted to write an Asian faction. And somebody at the project said, "Well, can we change it so that, yeah, it's coded Asian, but you don't have to be Asian to be in this faction?"
Hmm.
And I said, "Absolutely not." Um, and normally you shouldn't push back to somebody like that, but I was like, I'm going to push back. And I said, "Absolutely not," because within the lore that I wrote, a core theme here is a theme of resistance, a theme of being isolated within this vague setting that I can't talk about. This theme of being isolated. So if you want to make non-Asian consumers of this product comfortable by saying you don't have to be Asian to be in the Asian faction, I strongly disagree. Um, because
Hmm.
this is, again, an invitation to learn. You can't bring in people by not having these sort of guidelines, right? These guidelines
Yes.
exist for a reason, right? Coyote and Crow, the entire game is a guideline into exploring these cultures, like Haunted West, Harlem Unbound. These are all
Yes.
guidelines on how to try to tell these stories and learn about these different perspectives. And the Wu-Tang Clan, to circle back to the original question, they always acknowledge the roots, their origins. They always acknowledge the theater.
Yes.
They always acknowledge the fact that, hey, we were inspired by this cinema. We were inspired by the stories that they tell. The fact that, hey, I mean, the really famous one is, hey, our style beats your style, except it's not martial arts, it's music. And that's why I completely agree with you. Now, I've got a question, and this is one that I've often struggled with. Steve, I don't know if or both of you actually, I don't know if you've seen this movie, although, Stefan, because you're a scholar on this, I would assume that you've seen this. Steve, have you seen the film Ghost Dog?
Ghost Dog. I can say I've never seen Ghost Dog. What
Okay,
is Ghost
Yes.
Dog?
so just look up Ghost Dog. Um,
Yeah.
Ghost Dog is a very important film to this conversation because it is
Yes.
a part of this progression after the era of Jim Kelly's peak and
Hmm.
Cleopatra Jones and after the end of sort of that Blaxploitation era, because we could say that sort of Blaxploitation films kind of had this marked ending when, the sequel to Black Belt Jones, Hot Potato, was not a Blaxploitation film. It was just a true Hollywood action movie.
Yes.
But Ghost Dog sits in this kind of era that I want to discuss, and it's that same era as Wu-Tang when they released Enter the Wu-Tang in 1993. In 1999, this movie called Ghost Dog came out, and if you took, and I will say this, if you took the poster for Ghost Dog and you just made that the cover to a TTRPG, Twitter would be on fire.
Mm-hmm.
Twitter would 100%.
There is a TTRPG, by the way.
What?
Yeah, there's a Ghost Dog TTRPG. It exists.
What?
What? Yeah.
And Ghost Dog is a really good movie, but you really need to understand its roots in order to appreciate it.
Yes, you do.
And I think it's the same thing for movies like Black Dynamite in 2009. And it's the same thing for a really good movie that I think very few people have seen called The Last Dragon.
Yeah. Yes.
Because if you look at I see Steve looking it up. If you look at The Last Dragon, you're like, is this like a parody? But The Last Dragon and Ghost Dog they're over a decade apart, separated, but they are deeply influenced by that kung fu craze and Blaxploitation era.
Yes.
And what I think is really cool about Ghost Dog is that Ghost Dog was inspired by a French movie called Le Samurai, which subsequently was also the inspiration for one of my favorite movies, The Killer. I love John Woo movies. And Le Samurai basically was the inspiration for The Killer and Ghost Dog. And if you put them side by side, they just look so different, yet they're so similar. I love The Killer. Of the two, I think The Killer is more accessible than Ghost Dog. I think The Killer has got to be on some streaming services. I don't know about Ghost Dog.
It might be.
I'm not 100% sure, but they are both movies worth looking at. In terms of this conversation, don't worry about The Killer. Go look up Ghost Dog. But Ghost Dog is really interesting when you compare it to Blade, which came out a year before. And I think people really sleep on Blade. Not as a character, but the fact that literally everything that we enjoy now, all of the MCU, all of that shit would not exist if not for that Blade movie, if not for Wesley Snipes.
Absolutely.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think you touch on something very, very important because, like you said, the Blaxploitation genre kind of ends, but it doesn't end this association and this kind of connection, right, between Black and Asian culture. So The Last Dragon even features a scene in one of the iconic scenes in the film where you have a large group of African Americans in a grindhouse theater watching Enter the Dragon. And they are sitting there, reciting the lines along with the film, right? Obviously these are people who, like me, have watched these films many, many times, right? They've been sitting there probably watching this film every Saturday, and that, is obviously a callback to, this connection, right? And then the whole film, in and of itself, is this tribute to kind of the strength that the African American community gained through martial arts, and that's that's the main plot of the film, right? That that brings these things together, right? That brings Asian culture through the martial arts and just in general together. And you see again this connection, this deep respect that is married there. And then in Ghost Dog, like you said, it's a film where you really have to understand the roots of Asian cinema, particularly for that film, to go back even a little bit further and go back to the samurai epic and understand the roots of those, because one of the things that began to happen with these cinemas is in African American communities. Of course, we saw all the Shaw Brothers films and Golden Harvest films and all these other things, and many in these communities then started to look deeper, to dig deeper, to go into other forms of Asian cinema and Asian culture in general, and kind of start digging and saying, "Oh, what else can I find?" Right, and so that was how I discovered, Akira Kurosawa, and his great
And then
films,
the spaghetti
and
westerns that inspired that.
the spaghetti westerns, right? And there's this great exchange there, right? So we see, as for those who don't know, that the Seven Samurai and the Magnificent Seven and the Great Western are the same film, right? There's just one that is set in the American West and one that's set
And then
in
Star Wars
Japan.
is those two films in space.
Yeah, you have and then what is it for a Fistful of Dollars is Yojimbo.
Yep.
And there's like all of these connections between that in the spaghetti western, and then from there I just kind of branched out, and I think that happened with a lot of Black people in this era. We just started to look for more and found. So I discover films like Ugetsu, which if you have not seen the movie Ugetsu, anyone out there,
I don't know if I've seen that
man,
movie.
what a movie! Oh, it is probably my favorite Japanese film. It is a phenomenal movie.
I'm gonna try to hunt that down.
Yeah, it's great. You might, I don't know if it's still on there, but it was on HBO Max not too long ago.
There is a lot of, I mean, we could do a whole episode about sort of reinterpretations of white media by marginalized people, right? Because
oh gosh, yeah, we could.
Because if we're going to talk about Kurosawa and spaghetti westerns, we could also talk about Kurosawa and Shakespeare because of Ran. Because Ran is just King Lear, but a Japanese historical epic. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Throne of Blood, like all of those, absolutely.
There are a lot of really interesting connections there, and how you find your way to those things is interesting. Because like you know what, I didn't know about The Last Dragon until maybe like 8 years ago. Maybe.
Okay, yeah.
And is it 8 years? I want to make sure I get this timing right. 1 second.
Yeah. No, that's fair.
So I first learned about The Last Dragon, about 8 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe over 8 years ago, actually. Just about 8 years. So I learned about The Last Dragon because I'm a huge martial arts fan, and I really love MMA. I watch every single UFC card. I watch One Championships. I watch it all. And there is a fighter. His name is Alex Caceres, and his fighter nickname is Bruce Leroy. And I was like, what is that? And I looked it up, and it was like, oh my God, it's just from a movie. And that's how I learned about The Last Dragon, because of someone's homage to a film that is an homage to Kung Fu and Blaxploitation cinema. And again, there are these layers. And like Ghost Dog is a really interesting one because it's, again, a movie that is inspired by, like a white European film. Which has also inspired a Chinese film, like a Hong Kong action cinema film by John Woo, The Killer.
Yeah.
But then there's like ones that are like, in my opinion, a very obvious callback to the past. And to circle back, and for me, it's Blade, right? Blade is truly a callback to Blaxploitation films and the martial arts movies that inspired it because of his origins, right? He had those really humble origins. They kind of touch on those common portrayals of Black Americans in movies, especially in the 90s. But then he's a superhero. He is a superhero, and the first big Marvel superhero to ever be made into a good film. I will say good film, because there were movies beforehand. Dolph Lundgren played the Punisher, and oh god, that movie sucked.
Yeah, David Hasselhoff as Nick Fury.
Yeah, it's bad. But Wesley Snipes as Blade was incredible. And if you watch blaxploitation films and watch kung fu cinema, you see them in Blade.
Yes.
Yes.
And that is my biggest concern, actually, with the upcoming Blade movie, because I worry that it won't have those callbacks. Very similar to Blade's origins as a comic book character. Blade's origins as a
Yes.
comic book character were a direct result of blaxploitation media and
100%.
kung fu film, and I feel like that is going to be lost. Also, because they said that the new Blade movie is going to be PG-13, which I think is a travesty.
Yeah. Yeah. Ditto.
Because it being PG-13 also goes against that kung fu craze and the blaxploitation media, because they are ultraviolet.
Yeah, there's a grittiness and a rawness to all of those films that, again, I think was coming out as an expression of what these films were trying to accomplish, right? And many of them are filled with nudity because for the length and breadth of American cinema, um, it was not allowed to see black bodies as sexy. It was just not allowed. They could not be sex symbols in mainstream film, with very few exceptions. And so again, a lot of these films are pushing this envelope and saying, hey, what can we get away with? What can we demonstrate? Of course, a notable exception to the nudity is Cleopatra Jones,
Yep, there
which
was
is a
no
film
nudity
I
in that
also
movie.
greatly love. Yeah, Tamara Dobson, who by the way, is over 6 feet tall, and she's amazing as
That
Cleopatra
car
Jones.
is so awesome.
Yeah, her
It's
Corvette
a
is
Corvette
phenomenal.
Stingray, I think, something like
Corvette
that.
Stingray,
Oh,
yeah, and
it's
she's got like
cool.
weapons hidden in the doors and stuff like that, like you said, James Bond style. But she refused to do nudity, but she still has these moments where, by today's standards, people would decry this scene where she's like walking down the street and people are like whistling at her and
Yeah,
catcalling her and that sort of thing. But like, it was so significant at that time because we're coming out of a time frame where um um black women could not be objects of desire except for um, in this weird kind of Jezebel archetype where they were like
yeah.
fetishized by white men in a lot of films and things like that. Um, and so that movie is just, and not to mention the fact that, like you said, she's a government agent, she's a federal agent, and it's probably one of the first times I can remember going to a film and she, there's this great scene where she goes in and she comes back and she's mad about what's been going on, kind of the central story of the plot that I won't ruin for anyone who hasn't seen it. But there's this great scene where she calls like the white police captain who's kind of her ally in the Los Angeles police force, and there's like he knows she's mad about what's going on, and there's this visible fear in his face, and he's like, does she know I'm here? Like he's trying to get out of like talking to her. And then later on there's a scene where she tells him, look, my jurisdiction runs from Watts Towers to Ankara, Turkey, and those are some moments that are so amazing, particularly at that time, where here's this white police captain who's deferring to a black woman
Or
in
when
the early 1970s.
or when she takes out those assassins at the airport and she just flashes her badge and then walks away, and she's like,
And the cops are
"Clean up
just kind of
after
standing
me."
there. They're kind of like, okay, what just happened? Yeah, those moments like are so small, but also so huge because, they put forward this ideal of the power of this strong black woman, right, who's not going to take anybody's mess, not even these white cops, right? And that's a message that resonates today, let alone 1973. Phenomenal, just such an amazing film. But I think like these through threads that go through to like Ghost Dog, Way of the Samurai, through Last Dragon, through Blade, um, it shows this line that continues through even unto today. And I hope I have the same fears as you do, but I have this hope in your mind that will be wrong about the new Blade. um, like fingers crossed. But there are these great connections, and you even see little nods to them and other things. There's kind of the great moment in uh, Black Panther where they go to Korea, and
Mhm.
there's kind of the exchange before they go into the Korean nightclub. Um, that kind of lets you know that Nakia's been here before, that she's had these interactions here before, and so you see these connections, I think, in a lot of other films as well, in a way, because it is kind of something that, even though we see this kind of peak in the 1970s, we still see these homages that go back to it, even in films like Black Dynamite and things like that,
Great
which
movie.
does this. Yeah, it's this amazing, again, like parody, but at the same time homage of the Blaxploitation genre, and again brings in all of those aspects of the martial arts and things like that, and yeah, I love that film, and I love that that those connections and exchanges are continuing in movies to this day.
Yeah. I mean, if we're first of all, if we're gonna bring up Black Dynamite, and we've gushed about Wesley Snipes and Blade, we have to talk about Michael Jai White, because Michael Jai White is
Yes.
super significant to sort of like modern media, because he is the first Black American to play a superhero. He is Spawn.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
people forget about that. People, and I mean, like, there's this younger generation, and they'll look and they'll see Black Panther, and Black Panther is an incredible movie.
Yes.
But they forget about Spawn and Blade and how
Yeah. Those
important they are,
foundations.
right?
Those
Because
foundations.
If Blade wasn't a hit, Marvel would not be making movies today.
Yes.
Blade alone
100%.
is the reason why. And, and then Michael Jai White continues that sort of tradition outside of, Black Dynamite, which is like a literal homage to Blaxploitation. He continues that trend of being this martial arts star in all of the movies that
Yes.
he does. I mean, there are a lot of direct-to-DVD stuff, but they are good. And he is an
Mhm.
excellent martial artist. He's legit.
He
Um,
is. Yeah.
and I don't think he gets enough credit. Now, I've been in coming up with like a list of movies to talk about. There were two that I was kind of stuck on, and I wasn't
Okay.
sure where they would fit. Um,
Yeah.
the first one is The Matrix,
Yeah.
with Lawrence Fishburne.
Yeah.
The second one is Rush Hour.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay.
Rush Hour
Okay.
from the perspective of Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker being just like a dynamic duo, because I love the Rush Hour
Yes.
movies, but also
Yeah.
Don Cheadle in Rush Hour. Don Cheadle's cameo in Rush
Yeah.
Oh my
Hour
gosh.
2. Rush Hour 2.
I love that scene.
Because that scene and that character is referenced now by Kendrick Lamar.
Hmm.
But for me, I was always like thinking, I was like, yeah, that scene in Rush Hour, I think it's Rush Hour 2. Yeah, it's Rush Hour. Is it
It
Rush
is.
Hour?
I'm pretty sure you're right.
Pretty sure it's a Rush Hour 2. But that scene alone for me is like, oh, that is the nod to the 70s and 80s. The fact that
Yes.
you have this black guy who owns a Chinese restaurant and trains in kung fu and is equal to the Asian character.
Yes.
And you have Chris Tucker being the foil to the three of them.
Yes.
That scene speaks to me on many levels, because I've been gearing this up. So I've recently found a lot of old pictures of my grandpa when he first came to Canada, and so that's my grandpa. That's Danny Moon when he first came to Canada, and he owned a lot of different restaurants, and he was like a martial artist, and he was a part of those dojos where there were a lot of black people, and
Hmm.
he opened up a lot of restaurants. He was a serial restaurateur, and he opened some of the earliest Chinese restaurants in Toronto. So there's Danny's restaurant, and I actually have a picture of my mother working at the restaurant as a kid. And that's my mother and her brother. My mother's the one. That's my mother right there working at the counter, and you can't see it on the menu, but my mom told me about this. They served a lot of food that they felt would resonate with the black community. So they made Chinese food, and then they also made fried chicken, which you see a lot of at older Chinese restaurants during
Yeah.
the 60s, 70s, 80s, and like onward. Like fried chicken is
Still
something you'll
even
always
today
find.
sometimes.
You'll always find it at a Chinese restaurant. Um,
Yes.
and I thought that was just so interesting when they did that with Don Cheadle, except it was the reverse. Except
Yes.
it was the
Yeah.
reverse.
Hmm.
When I thought that was smart. But for me, the dynamic between Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan kind of falls more into the hot potato sort of representation than Black Belt Jones. I don't. Would you agree or disagree? This is where I'm kind of stuck.
Yeah, I think the Rush Hour films kind of take the standard buddy cop formula, and they then bring together this intersection of Black and Asian culture together. Um, and that scene with Don Cheadle, which I love so much, is kind of like the true culmination of that, like bringing together of these two things, and shows this kind of um, this intersection of these cultures and things like that. But I know I would think that that is a fair assessment, that you're making. Yeah, I would agree with that. This is kind of a shift, I think, to because Rush Hour is a very like mainstream film, and I think it went a long way, significantly, to kind of introduce um, the connections between these two cultures, probably to a lot of people at that time who weren't aware that they existed. And some of
It's a
them
good point.
I know for a fact. Some of them I know for a fact probably thought appropriation with the Don Cheadle scene and thought appropriation in some other scenes in the films. But in reality, if they took the time to dig deeper, they would find that again, this is an homage to these connections.
So I actually think Rush Hour 2 is the superior film when it comes to kind of what they're trying to do with it.
Agreed.
Hmm.
Rush Hour 1 struggles
Yep.
a lot. And of course, we can't talk about Rush Hour without talking about the infamous scene where Jackie Chan his character is in the bar at the pool hall
Oh
and he
yeah.
drops an N-word. And
Yes.
that was a very like interesting formative time for a lot of the kids that were out there watching this because it's a kids movie, right?
Yeah.
Kind
Yeah.
of,
Yeah.
sort of
Absolutely.
ish.
Kind of. Sort of. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what you see here is you see like this man who's been shown to be like an international super cop, right? Like he's like super competent and knows all this kind of stuff. Obviously a martial arts master at this point, and does it so casually and just like can feign ignorance afterwards, showing that even if you are like very powerful and you're like in the position of power, you can always just feign that ignorance here. And now that we're older and we can look back on that, there's no way like an international cop knows that this is okay, right? There's no way this could have possibly happened.
I I think
I
that
know it's
I don't think that Inspector Lee is framed as like he's not portrayed as an international cop. This is like clearly he's going overseas because of the counselor. Because he's not an
okay.
Interpol agent. He's a Hong Kong police officer.
That's
Um,
Hmm.
so for me, I think that particular joke, while crude, is their attempt, a very extreme attempt to show that he is a foreigner.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
think it's a very generous take on it.
It's a very
I think
generous take, but
Yeah.
it's a very. I mean, obviously the scene does not hold up. It is not a good scene. But
Yeah.
I think
Hmm.
I think if you kind of like try to like astral project to the writing room, it's like,
sure.
is that what they were trying to do? I don't know.
Yeah.
Stefan, what do you think?
No, I think I'm kind of somewhere in the middle between where both of you are. I'm kind of like in the middle there, and I think, yeah, I think it's fair to say that that's exactly what they were trying to do, but yeah, it does fall so flat.
There's intent
And
and execution. I think
Yes.
there is, yeah, 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 absolutely,
Steve said
100%.
in execution. I said intent.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting because that word in particular is one of those words that, if it ever gets said in my presence, um, regardless of who said it, if there are any white people in the room, I'm always looking at their reactions. That's my first thing because I want to see what the white people are doing when that word is said. Because their reactions are the most fascinating thing to me when that word actually gets said out in the open. Uh, because there's like this just amazing array of like, um, most of the time, this amazing array of like shock and not knowing what to do. It is the most like incredible spread of deer in the headlights looks you like ever see. Um, and so I did exactly that when I went to go see this movie in the theater. I'm kind of looking around at like the people in the theater when I went to go see that movie when that happened in that scene. And so yeah, I think it is. Like I said, I think I'm kind of in the middle between where you guys are. I think both of those are. It's one of those times where both of those things are simultaneously valid.
Yeah, I mean, like we're gonna get different perspectives on this. Like,
Yeah.
I think Steve, you're right. I'm being super generous.
Yeah, and I also might be like very hurt by that scene and hurt by like how, as a very young person looking at that scene, how that colored my view of that word, because I had looked up at Jackie Chan as this idol and seeing
Yeah.
a hero of yours say that word so casually multiple times in a row as a joke.
Yeah.
It really affected how I
That's-
began to engage.
I know that there, and this is not a defense of that because you're absolutely right. I know that one of the things Jackie has said in interviews since is that he didn't actually like the Rush Hour movies because he didn't understand them.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very clear that he doesn't understand it. I mean, he should. He's a grown ass man.
I certainly know that Jackie Chan is one of those, even though he's had some success in the United States. He is certainly not as a party to American culture. And there are certain strains and portrayals of people of color of Black people specifically in Asia that I think it would be fair to say, from what I know of Jackie Chan, that he probably got a little bit taken advantage of there, because I don't know. I think it might be fair to say that he may not have known the impact of that word when he was saying it.
I think that's fair.
I think that's pretty fair. Yeah.
I think that's fair. I mean, his
Yeah.
his English wasn't that great at the time either, right?
Yeah.
And
No, he was still yeah.
And he was kind of, that was the
Which
kind
is
of character. Yeah, I mean, which and that was kind of the character that he was playing, right? Because he was intent. If you look at all of his movies, Jackie Chan is intentionally trying not to be Bruce Lee. He is literally the opposite of Bruce Lee in every way: how he moves, how he acts, the types of characters he plays, right?
Yep.
And I think that's interesting to say that he was taken advantage of.
Now the writers darn well knew.
No,
right?
they 100%
The writers of that
knew.
film darn well knew. But I don't know that Jackie Chan fully did, because there's plenty of points where you can see through his films, through his interviews and things like that, where he does not fully understand some of the deeper nuances of Western culture. And to me, that comes across as one of those particular moments. And I would put the lion's share of the blame on the writers in that scene that kind of maneuvered him into doing that. I think if I don't know that he would have done it if he'd have realized.
And I mean, you could tell that they tried to do the joke again in Rush Hour 2, but with Chris Tucker trying to speak Chinese.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right?
they did. Yeah, they.
And then they didn't do that in Rush Hour. I guess they both tried to. No, actually, they did the same joke again in Rush Hour 3 at the dojo, when the whole "I am you, I you are me, that is me."
Yeah.
Yes,
that whole thing.
they did. Yeah.
I mean, Rush Hour 3 was not a good movie.
I was
I
gonna say,
think.
how do you remember anything from that movie? That
I mean,
movie is
okay, there was
horror
one.
for me.
There was one like really wild scene to me, and it's when Jackie and Chris sing Luther Vandross.
Yes.
Oh,
that's
yeah,
right.
yeah.
They sing Luther
Yes.
Vandross, and
Yes.
I thought that was funny. But yeah, Rush Hour 3 sucked. The TV show was fucking awful.
Yes.
If you folks ever watched the Rush Hour TV show, God, it's bad.
Rough.
It's
Rough.
It's real bad. But Jackie Chan hasn't done a movie like that, and he hasn't done a movie like that again.
It's true.
And I think if you were to do Rush Hour 4, how would you do it? Like, what would you do for Rush Hour 4? Like, I don't know what story you would tell. Like, they're both
Right.
significantly older now. And from like a political perspective, I don't know if Jackie would do that, because he himself as an individual has changed significantly since the original
Mm-hmm.
Rush Hour, because Jackie used to be pro Hong Kong, and now he's completely flip flopped in his politics.
Yes, he has.
So
Yeah,
I don't think he would actually do Rush Hour again.
I don't think he
I
would,
don't think it
and
would
I don't
happen.
know. Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, right now, for those who are tracking such things, actors like Jackie Chan need to be really, really careful about Western projects right now, because there's a massive, massive backlash from the Chinese government, from those who are appear in any way pro-Western right now. So,
Yeah,
uh,
100%.
I
yeah.
think what's important is to this is like a half gripe but half like thing to add on this conversation is that every movie we've talked about exists in a very specific time frame with very specific context going on politically, and that is why they are so powerful, right? Like all the movies we've
Yes.
talked about, things are happening and it's a direct commentary to the climate that is going on at that time. So when people say things like, "Oh, you could never make Blazing Saddles again. You can never make Rush Hour again," blah blah blah. Well, of course it can't. That's how time works. Like
Yeah.
we have to continue to
Yeah.
Yes.
progress.
Yeah.
So when it comes like, oh yeah, what would you like to see from Rush Hour 4? I would say I don't want to see Rush Hour 4. What I want to see is a black and an Asian lead talking about the current relationships between those communities in relation to like white supremacy in whatever geographical place they happen to be in, America, Canada, wherever it is.
Yeah. Hmm.
That's my Rush Hour. Like that's what it was when I boil it down to like what that.
I mean,
that piece of
they
meat.
made a movie like that. Uh, Shit.
While you look at up, just a quick gush. Best part of Rush Hour 2, opening scenes in their bathrobes, Chris Tucker, Jackie Chan doing some like combo moves.
Oh yeah, at the
Um,
massage parlor.
and I just wanted to gush that out because not nearly enough Asian and black leads having like this kind of like cooperative kind of like time. Like it's a very joyful scene in my opinion.
Another thing about Rush Hour is that you don't see is that the Asian lead is seen as desirable by non-Asian folks.
I mean, that's your
Yes.
anti Bruce Lee,
That's your
in my
anti-Bruce.
opinion.
So I
And
remember the
here's
movie. I had to look it up. Another one that I think again everyone slept on, but everyone knows that I love Justin Chon. Is a movie called Gook,
Oh my gosh, that is an amazing movie.
right? And then Gook, and then Blue Bayou, because I talked about Blue Bayou a lot on another podcast episode. But I think Gook it's not a comedy, but Gook is a drama. It's a drama about the LA riots.
Both of those movies are. That guy is an amazing filmmaker. Both of them
He
are
is, and
spectacular films.
I don't think he gets credit for. Everybody just is like, oh, he's Eric from Twilight.
Right, right, yeah,
Right?
yeah,
He's from Twilight. But yeah, I think Gook is a really good example of the kind of story that we'd want to see. Because for me,
hmm
when you look at current representation in terms of like what is, some might say like, Black Panther is what Blade was, and Blade is what, um like Cleopatra Jones was what Black
hmm
Belt Jones was all of that. For me, when I look at this, and this is my biggest gripe, is that the Asian community still didn't really get that. Shang-Chi is not my Black Panther.
Yeah, and I'm so bummed about that, man. I can't even tell you.
It's not my Black Panther because it's just another kung fu movie, but not in the
Yeah,
subversive way that it should have been.
yes,
Right?
I
Because
think
he
that's it right
the
there. That
story,
subversive part.
you can't say, oh well, we played down on the stereotype where he's kind of like that slacker Asian. Always Be My Maybe did that way better. And let's not forget that like everybody is like, if we want our like Asian hero, we literally have Keanu Reeves as well. Um,
Right.
but for me, it's like Shang-Chi could have been so much better if the plot literally didn't say go back to China to be a hero. That is the plot of Shang-Chi, and that fucking bothers
Yeah.
me so much.
Yeah.
And so for me, if I were to see like Twilight, not Twilight, sorry, I'm thinking about Twilight and Justin Chon. If I were to see my Rush Hour, it would not be, because I know some folks are going to be like, well, would it be Shang-Chi and Black Panther team up? It's not that. because
Mhm.
one half of that is not what I want.
Right. Yeah.
Because
No,
I want better representation.
yes. I think you've got to ground these films, and you've got to get, you've got to get essentially like what you were just saying, kind of like an Asian equivalent to Black Panther first, and then you can talk about doing team ups, right?
You know what I think would be a really interesting film to do? It would be a drama, but it would be a period piece set in World War II. And it would be a black and Chinese soldier in France. And I think that would be
Ooh,
a really interesting
Damn.
movie because you would, if anybody is Hollywood is listening, I'm down. But what I would do is
man, yeah,
because black soldiers and Chinese soldiers faced a lot of prejudice at home
yes,
and on the war front. And I think that would
yes,
be an incredible story to tell. And you would have two soldiers in the same sort of like maybe the same squad, and they have to survive. Honestly, here's my pitch, and I've been thinking about this a lot. What would the sequel to Prey be? The sequel to Prey, an incredible film, would be
Mhm.
set in World
yes,
War II, right? And you have um, a predator, Yautja is what they're called in the lore. You would have a predator hunting in France, killing Nazis. And your protagonists are a Chinese and black soldier whose squad is wiped out. Maybe after D Day, maybe they're paratroopers and they get separated from their squad. And now they have to survive and come together to defeat this alien that is also hunting them and hunting Nazis. And the Nazis are also hunting them. There's your sequel to Prey.
yeah,
So I'm gonna counter pitch you.
Okay, I want to hear it.
I want it not World War II, but because of the context of everything we've talked about, obviously in my mind, Vietnam War. Because a lot of the films we've talked about, obviously the Vietnam War is playing in the background. We are talking about people being sent to fight. Their bodies are resources that we're just kind of throwing to political wants and needs. I think we take that same concept. I want to bring this back to the jungle because I love that in
So
Predator.
the
I thought that
reason
was a great. Yeah,
Oh,
yeah, go
go
ahead.
ahead. So the reason why I wouldn't pitch the Vietnam War is because that setting is too close to the original Predator in terms of like
Sure,
the jungle, right?
sure.
That's my only reason why I wouldn't. But I love
so
your pitch because you also have the tension of fighting a losing war. You also have the tension of if we make it back home, will people even want us?
Exactly.
so
Exactly.
here's the fun part. You guys mentioned that, and one of my colleagues, uh, she was one of my mentors through my graduate program, and now one of my colleagues, we co-teach some classes together, and she does a class on the Vietnam War through film.
Mhm.
And
Mm.
we were having a discussion last week, and this topic came up of Predator because she also does. We're working right now on a 80s action cinema course,
Oh,
and and I'm like, you know, when you break it down, the original Predator is a Vietnam War movie.
yeah.
100%.
Yeah, 100%
100%.
is. Yeah, 100%.
It, you're in the jungle. They're fighting this unseen enemy, right? The way they
They just
learn
didn't
to
want to
defeat
say it
this.
was a Vietnam War movie.
Yeah, no, it's totally a Vietnam War movie. So
All
like, yeah, when Steve was saying that, I'm like, yeah, 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 yeah,
That's why
yeah,
it's too close, right? Because
yeah.
they also didn't want to make it a Vietnam War movie, also because of the '80s other Vietnam War movies were coming out. But they also
Hmm.
around that time there was also the big war on drugs, so that is
Yes.
also in people's minds. So
Well, it's also this intersection that's at the time when we're getting these films that are finally giving Americans the ability to win the war, right? In some way, shape, or fashion, whether it's missing in action or something like that, where we're trying to kind of flip this script and things like that, and being able to beat the Predator is kind of a symbolic winning of the Vietnam War. But I like this World War II idea because I think there's some great fodder there where you could have, um, even have this story where maybe there's like these different elements of units who kind of get trapped behind enemy lines and stuff
Yep.
like that,
Mm-hmm.
and cut off, and like you said, and then all of a sudden get embroiled in this uh, with this new enemy. I think Prey kind of established this great format, and of course with the little homage at the end that I won't give away for people to the series, that the format for Predator films now, man, I want to see more of these like
This
historical
isn't the
Predator
first
films.
time. Yeah, I think that like, and another thing about World War II that I think is important is that we don't get you don't get to see people of color in World War II movies in the spotlight. You don't see them with big roles. You
Yeah.
will occasionally see them, but for the most part, people who tell World War II stories are telling the stories of white people. It's how I feel about World War One as well, right?
Yes,
But
yes.
I think in terms of setting wise, you could do a lot from a production perspective and a storytelling perspective. You could do a lot more with World War II than you could World War One.
You can, I think you can look at, and I think you're absolutely right, because and typically when you do get stories, you get stories of people of color of World War II, of these kind of very specialized tales, right? So you get movies about the Tuskegee Airmen, you get movies about the Navajo Code Talkers.
We
You
were
don't really
Wind
get,
Talkers, John Woo
yeah,
movie.
yeah, yeah, you don't get these stories of the grunts, right? The people who were on the ground. The only one that like very quickly comes to my mind, and there's a few out there. The one that first comes to my mind is Go for Broke, about the 442nd.
Oh my god, yeah.
Um the old black and white film, but the you don't really have too many about the story of people of color who are like the ones who are actually in the front lines of a lot of these battles. Supposedly we're supposed to be getting a movie about the all black 761st tank battalion,
Ooh.
that's supposed to be coming, uh, that's been kind of in various production points. I hope they get that made, because like, that would be kind of a great little story to tell. But I would love to see something like that, where, like you said, kind of this intersection, because I think there's some wonderful conversations that goes back to this idea, this wonderful conversations that could be had between um, an African American and a Chinese American character, particularly in this locus of, here we are fighting this war for global freedom. Meanwhile, back home, or even you could even have a Japanese American character like involved
I
in
mean,
here,
it's the
right?
exact same story that you could
You
tell,
know,
like in Kong Skull Island. That's the story, right?
Oh
The
man.
yeah,
beginning of
yeah,
Kong Skull Island. That's another
yes,
example of cultural exchange as part of the narrative, right?
yes,
And that dynamic, but I mean, they're initially, enemies, and they kind of come together against a common foe, which is the island. Um, but that dynamic is another thing that you could tell. But you could do that in different conflicts. But I think um, World War II is a good one because a lot of folks were like, "Why are we even fighting this?" On
yeah.
both sides, right? In Vietnam War is another. I mean, I don't want to discredit your idea, Steve, because I think it's a dope idea. Um,
I don't feel that way at all. No, this is open
because
conversation.
because you could also bring in like the. I think personally, I just think it would be too close because I was like, oh, how would you beat the Predator during the Vietnam War? Well, obviously, like that guerrilla warfare tactics were the thing that won that conflict. Um,
Yes,
and you would just do that. It would for me, it would just feel like a rehash. But the political undertones of that story, I think, would be very, very compelling.
Yeah.
I think what would be interesting there is if you were to get this group of people kind of again cut off, right? Kind of on their own, and then the way to beat the Predator is for this group of maybe a couple of surviving African American soldiers now have to team up with these either Viet Cong or North Vietnamese soldiers to fight against the
That would be
Predator.
cool.
And I think that would be, again, this great locus to kind of like flip the script and um, invert the kind of story now, because now you have these black troops kind of learning these things from these either North Vietnamese or Viet Cong fighters, these guerrilla war tactics, right? That essentially is what Arnold is using to defeat the Predator in the original film.
Yep.
But now we get this kind of more pure kind of like origin of that, and I think that would be kind of interesting to see.
Another interesting one is I wouldn't be mad if they did a modern one. Not like The Predator, not like the one with Olivia Munn.
Hmm.
But I would love to see. Have you folks seen Vampires versus the Bronx?
Great movie.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Great movie,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
I wouldn't do it as a
Yeah.
comedy and I wouldn't have it involving children. But the backdrop of a neighborhood being gentrified and these murders happening would be really interesting, a really interesting way to tell a story about the Predator. Because you
Hmm.
could then bring in contemporary issues like, the way policing is in America and the overreach of force and the use of these like killings to justify their actions against a marginalized community and the community taking, measures into their own hands. I think
Yeah.
could be an interesting story to tell because then you could have other marginalized communities because often these communities are like adjacent to one another.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That's a great, another great intersection where you could have, because as you know, in cities all across North America, you have these kind of intersections of Black and Asian communities, right? And
Sonia in the chat brought up
these.
Attack the Block. That's
Oh
it.
gosh, I love
Yeah,
that movie.
that
Love that
John
movie.
Boyega.
Love that movie.
John Boyega.
Love it. That 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 intersection of those communities, I think, would be a great place to tell a story, because it is one of those areas that, like what we're talking about right now, right? These intersections of communities, it has been engineered by the powers that be, to create tension between the
Hmm.
Black and Asian communities. So many communities have been shaped by the idea, for this long-standing idea where Asian proprietors were able to come into Black communities and be able to access loans that the Black people who lived in those communities could not access. And that built up this tension that, like, Gook addresses excellently, I think, as a film. It's like a phenomenal
It's a
movie.
great indie
Um,
film.
so amazing. It addresses those tensions and part of what was happening in the LA riots. And I remember those riots keenly because I was in LA when they happened. And there was this great tension there because there was this resentment that, again, was engineered, was built in with the Black community, saying that, like, we don't own any businesses in this community. We don't own any of this. We don't even own the houses we're living in, but we see around us people who are Korean, people who are Chinese, able to come in and own these businesses in our communities. And that is, again, that is a very calculated design that the United States and obviously Canada learned from the British Empire. They learned this strategy of divide and conquer to pit different marginalized communities against one another, because if we're bickering with each other, we're not looking up,
We're not paying
and we're not
attention.
seeing. Yep, we're not seeing, the source of the oppression for all of us. We're too busy fighting each other, and that is cold, pure calculation. And like I said, they learned that from the British, because this is something that the British deployed in India. It's something they deployed in Southeast Asia. They deploy it in Africa,
These are the tactics
literally
of a
all over the world.
colonizer.
Of
Yeah,
colonizers.
absolutely,
Yes.
100%. It
Yep.
is absolute colonizer tactics.
Yeah, 100%. And it's you get them to defeat each other, and you don't even have to. You just kind of stand back. And I think to circle back to our original topic, and I think that's what made kung fu films so important because they brought these communities together, right? They
Yes.
brought them together in something that unified them, even though maybe languages weren't the same. The understanding
Hmm.
that, hey, there is this injustice that must be solved by your community, and you cannot trust
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
government, the
There.
man, the police. It's
Yeah.
they,
You said that strain is there through all of those, like you
yeah,
said.
it's there in
Hmm.
all of them, and that's the thing that I think is missing right now. I think
Yeah.
I think
I
that's the
think
thing that's
I
missing right now.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Thanks. So it's connected to like Daniel said earlier on, like there's no like Asian Black Panther moment. And I think what you've said is the reason why I think there isn't one. Is because everything we've talked about so far, all of the movies that we carry with us and we feel like you know, brought us value, it talks specifically about power dynamics, like who has power, who doesn't have power, how does power shift and ebb and flow throughout the movie. Black Panther very much is about who has power and who doesn't, and what do you do with that power once you have it. Shang-Chi
Mm-hmm.
does talk about power a little bit, but it just fails to talk about like what you do with that power once you have it. Oh, you fight a dragon. Cool. Here we
Great.
have an like Black Panther, we have an empire, and we talk about, you know, what do you do with that power once faced with the reality that some people never got that power? What are you gonna do now? And that's the quote Black Panther moment, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And this entire conversation, it excites me because I want to go back to all these films we talked about, especially the ones I've never seen. It's really funny you mentioned The Last Dragon. As soon as I googled it, I knew exactly the movie it was. I just didn't know by name because like
Yeah.
It's a great
the
movie.
imagery I know, I just don't. I've never
Yeah.
seen this. Start to finish.
Yeah.
It's why a movie like Ip Man
Yeah.
resonates so deeply with folks.
Yes.
Far more so than Shang-Chi, because Shang-Chi is just a movie about you having parent issues.
Yeah.
It's just a movie about you having parent issues. But like, yeah, I want that. Black Panther has these moments that, but also Black Panther has moments that anyone can understand too. The
Yes.
museum scene is fucking incredible.
Yeah. Yeah.
The museum scene is so well written. Also, like Michael B. Jordan himself, Michael B. Jordan as like a personality, his love of anime is,
Mm-hmm.
it's just everything that he does is just like he embodies what we're talking about right now in the characters that he
Absolutely.
plays, how he conducts himself.
That's
I
why
think
we
it's-
need. That's why we need the anime episode.
Well,
Because
well, that's what we're
showing up
gonna
to
do.
See a movie with fucking Saiyan armor. I see that.
Oh
I see
yeah,
what you're
yeah.
doing.
He wore Saiyan armor. That like
Yeah.
I mean, we have to do a whole episode on anime because we need to talk about Afro Samurai. We need to talk about Samurai
gosh,
Champloo.
yes.
We have to talk about Samurai
Yes.
Champloo. In a way, we also have to talk about Cowboy Bebop and music, right? But we also have to talk about the negative portrayals of Black people in anime, right? We
Yeah.
have to talk about the caricatures because that's an important part. And I think we also need to talk about, I think it'd be really, we need to find the guest for this, but we need to, I want to interview someone like a Black creator who is making anime, who's making manga, because what does it mean to make anime?
Yeah.
We also need to have Japanese people on the panel as well, because there are
Mhm.
so many different perspectives. There are the perspectives of those who are in Japan. There are perspectives of those who are in the West. There are perspectives of those who are Asian, and there are perspectives of those who are not Asian. And I think the anime topic is actually a far more complex one than the kung fu topic. That's what I think, because I'm like, how do I approach this? With the kung fu one, I
think-
knew exactly how to approach it.
I think with like not only with anime but with Japanese cinema in general, it's very interesting to me when I read reactions to either Japanese films or American-made films that portray Japan. The reactions, as is true with a lot of diasporic cultures, the reactions of people who are in the West and those who are in Japan, very different.
Very different.
Very different.
Yeah.
Very different. And it's the same, and we see that in like on TTRPG Twitter and online. Remember when they
Yes.
announced the new all the different Captain Americas, and they said, hey, we have a Filipino American Captain America. And there are some folks who are like, oh my God, this is amazing. And there are other folks who are like, this person is literally championing the colonizers of our land.
Yep.
Yep.
So there are so many different perspectives here to take into account.
Mhm.
And I think that's an incredible, I think that shows that we need to do more episodes like this. Before we started recording, we were talking about how Asians Represent can no longer do the kind of content that we first started doing. We can't just kind of sit down and be like, let's talk about this game because there is more at play. Let's talk about your game, but let's also talk about the social issues that inspire it and why this is an important conversation to talk about, right? If we were just focusing on games, or if we were just focusing on reading Oriental Adventures, we wouldn't have been able to have you, Stefan, on this podcast. We wouldn't be, we wouldn't have considered talking about it because, like you said, Steve, we've been thinking about doing this episode for a really long time, but just it didn't fit with the content that we were currently doing. And I'm just really happy that we as a team decided, you know what, this is important. We need to do this. And I want to make sure that we continue to do so. So I'm just super grateful, Stefan, that you joined us to share your knowledge. Because I'm honestly I'm honestly just like blown away. Like I have a tab open on my browser, Yugetsu. I'm like, I'm gonna watch that because I'm super curious about it. I need to
let me know what you think once you've seen it.
I think I'm gonna like it. I mean, I gotta rewatch Last Dragon. There are a lot of movies that I haven't that my partner hasn't seen. So I want to show my partner a lot of these movies. I still haven't gotten her to watch all of Hard Boiled, which is one of my favorite movies of all time.
Oh gosh, love Hard Boiled.
She couldn't understand, like it was just like so over the top. Couldn't make it past the tea house scene. I was like, this is so good. So
and people don't realize how influential I think today John Woo is.
Oh
right?
my God,
on action cinema.
The Matrix, if you think about it, The Matrix would not exist if not for Blaxploitation, the Kung Fu craze, and the Hong Kong blood opera, which is the genre that John Woo operates in.
Absolutely.
100%. And people don't realize that The Matrix is it's so funny that you have like these white supremacists trying to commandeer the Matrix and call
the
pills red pills and everything. Oh. And I'm like, have you looked at the cast of the Matrix? Have you looked at the makeup of have you looked at the makeup of Zion? What are you talking about? Like,
Jada Pinkett Smith was badass in the Matrix and badass in the video game Enter the Matrix.
Yes, she was.
Right?
Yes, she was.
And the video game
Ghost, Asian
Ghost
character.
was her,
was like,
amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
It's we could. Oh, the Matrix is like a whole other episode.
I was going to say you could do a whole thing on the Matrix.
You could do a whole thing on the Matrix because we've talked about because the Matrix is a cyberpunk movie in a way, but it's cyberpunk in a way that doesn't appropriate Asian culture. You could see that appreciation for Asian culture and its roots. But John Woo's influence on literally all modern action cinema is undeniable.
Yes.
We could do a whole episode just on John Woo. I fucking love John Woo. I have all of his movies on DVD. I love his movies so much.
He's phenomenal.
Yeah, and he's done some really interesting stuff. And if you look at his like American movies, they're different, right? Like Face Off, masterpiece. Absolute masterpiece of a movie. Mission Impossible 2, right? But Face Off, fucking incredible. Broken Arrow, Blackjack. I don't know if you've seen Blackjack. That one's like you know you're a John Woo fan if you've seen Blackjack because it's an unaired. It was supposed to be a TV pilot and they made it into a movie. And or like an interesting one is John Woo made Wind Talkers.
Yes, he did.
Which is like an interesting choice for a Chinese director to make a movie about Navajo code talkers. It's a very interesting director choice, but he was kind of riding that wave at the time.
Yes.
But I think there are a lot of different topics that we could talk about, and I think there are a lot of really interesting intersections that we need to address on this podcast. And I think, the episode that we did with Navarre and this one are both really good examples of the content that I think, Steve, you and I are trying to make now. I think this is the type of content we want people to learn from, right?
Yes.
We do Asians Represent because we want to have a positive impact on as many communities as possible, right? Because
Mhm.
Just like we talked about, Asians Represent is not content made for Asian people.
Yeah.
These are guidelines on how to approach these issues and learn from us. Just
Yes.
like, these movies we've been talking about. Kung Fu cinema is not just for Chinese people. It's very much also a movie for any marginalized community that faced oppression, has faced injustice, and is looking for, heroic role models. And I think, and I don't know if there's a connection between the two, but you see parallels now with a lot of South Asian cinema too, with like martial arts and South Asian cinema. Although,
Yes.
I mean, a lot of kung fu and martial arts actually originated in South Asia, so there's like a whole conversation there to talk about.
Absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
think we should do an episode on that
Absolutely.
too. But that said,
Yeah, there's a lot there.
we would not be able to do Asians Represent if not for our amazing patrons. So if you folks want detailed show notes on this episode, all of the notes that I just, all of the research that I did, all of the references, anything like that, you can find us on Patreon. If you want to give us a couple bucks a month just to, help us maintain the Discord server that we have, like, let us know. We appreciate all of you. This is hard for me because this is the second time I've done our patron shout out without Marla. Um, but I am super grateful for everyone who's ever helped us, past and present, keep Asians Represent going. Particularly our current Guardians of the Realm, Brooke, Jeremy, Daisy, Arjun, Justin, Wayan, Kavi, Matt, NamiX, Jay, and then, of course, our most honorable patrons, Metalweave Games. Congratulations on your recent award. Valorous Games, I know that Liana there's a huge Valor stream that's happening, and I'm super hyped for that. I think Valor is actually a really, what I've just thought about it. Valor would be a really good system to emulate a lot of the films we were talking about, with like action and stuff, with like iconic like attacks and moves and stuff. It wouldn't be as fantastical, but you could do a lot of these kung fu films and these sort of hybrid kung fu blaxploitation films using Valor.
100% agree. 100% agree.
And then, of course, there's Dungeon Glitch / Matt and the most honorable times to Epic Impulse and Bob C. Thank you, folks, for your support. We absolutely appreciate you. But that said, Stefan, I have to say thank you for joining us. I hope this was as positive of an experience for you as it was for me. It has been a pleasure having you on the show. You are always welcome on Asians Represent. I can't wait for us to just. I hope one day we could just meet in person and
Absolutely.
have a meal.
I would say this. I would love to have a meal with you guys. I would love to play a game with you one time. Sit down and play a game with you at one point.
We should try to
Thank
make that
you.
happen. We should try to
We
make that
should.
happen. I know that there's talk of us trying to do like a charity stream or some sort of game in like the fall. I would love to. I think it would be really interesting to try to do like a spy game.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I think it would be really cool to try to do a spy game, because it could be a
Yeah.
modern spy game or it could be a historical one. I actually have this idea for a spy game that I've wanted to do, like a Mission Impossible-esque thing. So I think it'd be really cool.
That would be awesome.
Okay, I'll say this. We could do the Behind Enemy Lines World War II story in a TTRPG format.
I was waiting for you to pitch it.
Because
Sign me up.
because I could do that with Ross rifles.
Absolutely, you could.
Honestly, you know what? I think we should fucking do that.
Sign me up.
Like, I think we should do that. I think I want
I'm there.
I think we have like four players, like and we tell a story about a group of soldiers who are, trapped behind enemy lines and have to make it out alive. And this could be a 2-parter, it could be a 1-parter. We can make it purely historical, or we could put in the fact that there is an alien fucking hunting everyone. I think this
I'm
could
there.
be really fucking cool.
If we want to do an alien hunting everyone, I'll run 10 candles.
Oh,
100%
with
over
10,
10
10
candles.
here's the thing. 10 candles would be really good if we were in person.
Well, that's the thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Unless we had
Anyways.
a camera on the 10 candles.
Right.
I've made it happen before. We'll talk about it.
We could do it. Like I would bend over backwards to try to tell this story. We'll figure out a system. I think we should try to aim to do. You know what would be really cool? We do this in October for like a Halloween sort of thing. I think that'd be really neat. It will also give me
That'd be
time to
awesome.
prep.
It'd be awesome.
Okay, I'm gonna start workshopping this because I'm really hyped about this. But again, it's time. Stefan, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Agents
Thank you for
Represent.
having me on.
I'm so glad we did this. And Steve, I'm glad you're back on the podcast. I think I missed you on the last one. I'm glad you're also taking time to take care of yourself and be on vacation.
No, thanks for giving me space and like time just to do my own thing when I needed it. And I'm back now, feeling great. No, what a great episode to come back to, right? For me.
Right, Steve just comes back and it's just like boom, awesome episode. But that said, thank you everyone. Stay tuned because next Friday we're actually going to be diving into the 1D&D document for Bubble Tea Book Club. And if you want access to the full VOD of that, you have to be a patron. Otherwise, you can catch us live on Friday, last Friday of the month, 7 p.m. Eastern for Bubble Tea Book Club. That said, take care, everyone. Stefan, thank you for joining Steve and I.
Thank
you
you.
are
Thank you.
amazing. Bye, everyone. We'll see you next time.